Good morning and welcome to episode 9 of the Guyana Business Journal and Caribbean Policy Consortium webinar series Transforming Guyana. I'm Terrence Blackman, Associate Professor of Mathematics at Medgar Evers College here in the City University of New York and the founder of the Guyana Business Journal. And I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. David Lewis of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and Manchester Trade Incorporated. As we prepared for this program, I received a number of questions around agriculture, around the sort of vision for the GBJ, and I thought that I would take a moment this morning to kind of sketch out what we viewed as the GBJ slash CPC vision. We want to be a place for innovative and practical recommendations that advance, as we see it, sort of three broad goals, overarching goals. Uh, a, sort of strengthening Guyanese democracy. B, fostering economic opportunity, social welfare, security, and opportunity for Guyanese. And C, sort of ideas that would secure an open, safe, prosperous, and cohesive Guyana in which all Guyanese, irrespective of race, class, ethnicity, religious persuasion, can share equally in the economic prosperity of Guyana. So, in a sense, that's our big vision. Uh, this series, Transforming Guyana, aims to bring together experts and prominent voices from Guyana and the Caribbean and the diaspora to discuss the impacts of Guyana's oil and gas development. We want to take a sort of nuanced look at the opportunities and the potential pitfalls ahead for Guyana. And we want to explore strategies to maximize the positive impacts that the oil revenues can have on Guyana's people, future, while at the same time mitigating the risks that other countries have faced. And since we are part of the broad Guyanese diaspora, we want to identify roles that the diaspora can play in this transition. And so it's in that context that today we want to examine agriculture and the oil and gas economy. And perhaps for some context, uh, agriculture and fossil fuels are really nominally two different industries, but they have a relationship. Agriculture relies on energy inputs such as fossil fuels for operations in irrigation, tillage, transportation, production of fertilizers and pesticides. And on the other hand, the extraction, transportation, use of fossil fuels can, at times, uh, positively and negatively impact agriculture through soil and water pollution and the overarching question of our time, climate change. Our contention in this program is that the agricultural sector in Guyana has a very special role at this juncture in its history. And as the oil and gas economy begins to, broader, to sort of dominate the economic landscape. And what we want to do here today is to explore some strategies for the agricultural sector to optimally complement the emerging energy sector. And we're fortunate that our discussion will be led by Dr. H. Arlington Chesney, a leading Caribbean agricultural professional who has served Guyana, the Caribbean, and the hemisphere. He was awarded the Guyana's Golden Arrow of Achievement for his contributions to agricultural development in Guyana and the Caribbean. And we're also joined by one of the bright young voices of Guyana, Joel Bagwindian, a business and financial professional with more than 15 years of experience in the financial sector, corporate finance, finance management, risk consulting, and academia. Uh, Joel has been actively engaged in providing insights and analyses on a range of public policy, economic, and macro finance issues for the last 6 years, and in this regard, he's authored. I mean, I'm often stunned by his productivity. He's authored more than about 300 articles covering, these various thematic areas in public policy and macrofinance. So I want to welcome both Dr. Chesney and Mr. Gerald Bagwind into the meeting here today, and I want to ask my colleague, Dr. David Lewis, to have a few introductory remarks. David?
Thank you, Terence. Good morning. Good morning, Arlington and Joel in Trinidad and in Guyana, respectively, and welcome to our audience in the virtual world, in Guyana, in the diaspora, and regionally and internationally. I think, as Terence mentioned, we've been touching on several complementary aspects of the oil and gas economy in Guyana over these months. And one of the key ones that had come up, and we wanted to focus on it and take advantage of a lot of the public commentary that Arlington has been doing on agriculture in the regional media, in the Guyana media, to really raise this issue as another area of complementarity in the broader economic growth and development agenda of Guyana, spurred by the oil and gas boom, but standing on its own in terms of the importance of the agricultural sector in the Guyanese economy, in terms of labor, in terms of production, in terms of consumption, and also now with the initiative in CARICOM since last year of 25 and 25 to be able to replace food imports with local regional production, how to really leverage this economic growth, the inflow of capital, the new economic activities to make sure that the agricultural sector in Guyana, like many others which are advancing, whether it be infrastructure, construction, utilities, tourism, and other services, also benefits, but also grows at the level that can match the needs of the domestic population, but also regional needs. I remember since my first visits to Guyana way back in 1982, we've always talked about the possibility that Guyana is the breadbasket of the Caribbean, with these large extensions of land and possibility of growing all sorts of foods and crops and produce. And yet that has not materialized. And a lot of it has to do with investment needs. A lot of it has to do with technology. A lot of it has to do with infrastructure and resource limitations. So now, if indeed we have this growth period, let's find ways where we can ensure that these linkages in the economy feed back, because Guyana, regardless of how big and how dominant the oil and gas sector is going to become, beyond the numbers and beyond the statistics, what's going to happen is the rest of the economy needs to continue to live, and we need to find ways to get that to leverage. I'm particularly interested in what I call the whole food and beverage economy. How do we feed ourselves? How we beverage ourselves, produce, crops, manufacturing, and how that becomes tangible at the local, the regional, local, domestic, and regional level, and ways in which now taking advantage of this positive economic growth situation where we can leverage that to higher levels and make sure that these value chains, the capitalization and the commercialization of agriculture, of crops, of food and beverages can really grow both at the domestic level, but also at the export level regionally. And Arlington is an excellent person for this because he's had experience not only in Guyana and the Caribbean, but throughout the Americas. And we have many examples of successful public and private initiatives in the agriculture sector, in the food and beverage sector throughout the Americas that I think at some point can come to bear for Guyana's development and initiatives taking place with local companies. And we'll discuss some of those as we advance on this program today. So again, welcome everybody. and we look forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I want to take the moderator's prerogative to do the following. So in my world as a math person, one of the things that I've been involved with is something called the Queens College Alumni Association of New York Math Camp. And in the math camp, what we often do is we want to allow students to have a connection between the mathematics that they do in the classroom and the wider world. And for me, this business of agriculture was most sharply put into relief in one of those math camp events, I think in about 2017. And I went back and looked for a clip that I was interested in. One of the iconic Guyanese businesswomen, so a young lady who passed away not so long ago, her name was Alison Butters Grant. And we invited her to the math camp to give a small talk. And so I will cue a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes of her presentation to the young people that day, and you'll see why I cue it. And after that, we'll ask Arlington to kind of give us the broad sense. So let me share with you some thoughts from Alison Butters Grant, Guyanese businesswoman, from a few years ago in the Queens College Math Camp.
No, seriously. No, seriously. And as much as you're laughing, no, it's serious business because guess what? Our import bill into Guyana is unrealistic. It's a shame that we're carrying double digits and close to triple digit millions of US dollars of imported food stuff into this country. It's a shame. And why I say it's a shame, it's because if we fed ourselves, we would have surplus to export to the same people who are taking our produce, manufacturing it into all kinds of things and shipping it back to us. And then we buy our own things after they make whatever they make and they add value. So when value is added to raw material, the price goes up. Now I'm in the fishing industry. My goal and my vision is to take all of our local fish and manufacture it into different products. We're working on a new facility in Victoria that is going to be a zero waste facility. Right now we're even saving the scales from some of our big fish, because the scales are used to make jewelry in China. Now, why are we shipping our scales to China, who are going to manufacture our scales, and they want to pay next to nothing on the dollar for our products? And then they take it to China, and that same pair of beautiful Kafam scale earring that you would not even recognize that it's coming from one of our fish, a pair of those earrings will cost $20 US. I was in Barbados a couple months ago to a women export convention funded by the Caribbean Development Bank. There was a young lady from St. Lucia. I bought a necklace from her. I paid $45 US for it. Beautiful. And guess what it was made from? No. It was made from tamarind seeds and cocoa seeds. And then it was polished into a very nice finished product.
There you go. Tamarind seeds, cocoa seeds, kafam fish. The agricultural sector has a vast array of wonders. Dr. Arlington Chesney, give us some thoughts on how Guyana can sort of optimize its arable land in its agricultural sector. The floor is.
Well, Terence, David, thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this exercise. It's a very important exercise. And that was a good clip also, because it introduced it to the totality of our culture. It's something I talk about. And it also introduced the concept of loop value chains rather than straight value chains. And when she talked about a zero waste factory. Now, Terence, you gave me some parameters to factor my presentation in. One was scope and scale. Two was opportunities. Three was challenges. And four was how Guyana is coming along in this exercise and of linking agriculture and the oil and gas economy. I say coming along because it's not going to be an immediate activity, an immediate what you call slam dunk in the basketball terms, or immediate six in cricket terms. Now, in terms of scope and scale, first of all, I want to emphasize, and this is something that I think David may have indicated, is that you cannot talk of Guyana's agriculture outside of a very critical link to regional agriculture and food security. Right? So some of you may have seen a clip yesterday from the Minister of Agriculture, and the clip was headlined, "Region achieves 57% of the 25% that is supposed to reduce the food import bill by 2025. In other words, the region has found 14% of reduction, 14% roughly of its food imports, right? But you have to look very deep into the article to find what is Guyana's contribution. So it is clear that Guyana has bought into this exercise, into this concept that Guyana's agriculture is linked to the thing. Now, this is followed by in 2020. Sorry, not followed, but in 2020, Guyana took the mantle of leadership as lead head within the quasi-cabinet of CARICOM for agriculture. And Guyana has been a critical part in moving this process forward, right? The question of the first regional agricultural investment forum was held in Guyana, right? And we have a number of things by President Ali, a number of initiatives. We've seen the initiatives of the black belly sheep coming from Barbados, right? We've also seen at that same symposium, Vice President Jagdo, perhaps the first person to link the financial requirements and the technical requirements and the work requirements if the 25 by 2025 initiative is to be successful. But I want us to remember that the Regional Food Security Initiative was really started by Prime Minister Motley in 2018-2019, when she identified agriculture as being a key contributor to revitalization and invigorization of the CARICOM single market economy. This was before COVID, before oil bonanzas, and certainly before Ukraine. So we have to thank Prime Minister Motley for her vision, right? And agriculture, as I think it was Terence who identified, is intermingled and intertwined with a number of other sectors: trade, education, engineering, infrastructure, security. A lot of people don't realize the linkage between security and agriculture. Is maybe in the question and answer time I could elaborate a little bit on that. And more recently, digitalization and ITCs. The second scope is that, and for this discussion, what is agriculture? We, sometimes in our colonial mentality, tend to think agriculture is the production of primary commodities, and with shovel and hard work, right? Now, agriculture is much, much greater than that. Agriculture is the production of inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, other equipment, production of primary commodities, production of processed foods, including production of secondary commodities, including processed and frozen stuff, marketing, transport, and other logistics. So we're really talking about a new agriculture, an agriculture which suggests that agriculture is much, much more than food on the table. And I think we need to put those concepts in place as we have our discussion on agriculture. What are some of the opportunities? I think politically, this is the first time in decades that we have all CARICOM heads stating, particularly, how should I say, providing the photo ops, which indicate that agriculture is very important in the development, the sustainable development of the region and of individual member countries. And I want to stress the region and individual member countries, because it will not be appropriate for security and other and social reasons for Ghana to think of itself alone of doing the best thing for agriculture and to utilizing their oil to do the best thing for agriculture. It will not happen smoothly. Secondly, and this is a part of that, Guyana, because of its large size and small population, cannot consider its market to be only its own. It must, in the second instance, deal with the regional market within the protection that is provided in the common external tariffs, and then it could allow it to hone its resources and methodologies and processes to go to the wider world. Within that context, the oil and gas economy sector allows us to magnify or increase the agricultural activities of Guyana. We expect to have at least 8 rigs and 12 production, storage, offloading vessels, PSOVs, right? These are captive markets for Guyanese agricultural products. But those markets must be, because of the nature and the confined nature of the vessels, they must provide safe food, nutritious food on a timely and on a reliable basis at acceptable prices. I'm not saying at cheap prices, but at acceptable prices to both the user and the provider. Once we get that going, it will allow us to repeat to hone our processes, because export production has to be very fine-tuned, particularly when you go to Europe and the States. So with that aspect, we could now move to outside of Ghana for exports. The second aspect of these opportunities, with the proposed refinery and the gas to shore projects, we have the ability to produce inputs, whether it be fertilizers, pesticides, etc., right? And B, better processing capacity because of the cheaper electricity that could be provided, right? Now, as we go into processed products, I want to suggest very strongly that, unlike what may have happened in Trinidad, the inputs for the processing or for the storage must come from Guyana and the rest of the region. If not, we will only be increasing our food imports, because the trend these days is for the housewife to want ready to cook or ready to eat products. So, and this is where the increases take place. So we need to look at that. It also allows Guyana to develop and restructure its agricultural sector in a way that it will be climate climate resilient, because Guyana is already suffering, as most of the region is, and most of the development, the island countries are suffering from the negative impacts of climate change. You really can't have a discussion on agriculture in the absence of a conjoined discussion on climate change. What are some of the challenges? Firstly, the continued image of our culture being a third cousin in the family. From the school level, we have to change this. We have to ensure that people recognize that our culture is a business. You could make money in our culture, and it is not only labor intensive. It is also technologically intensive, particularly as we go into shade house development, container development, agriculture development, etc. The next thing is that next challenge is that our traditional importers of agricultural products need to come on board. They need to see not necessarily production in the first instance, but providing a regular market at a fair price for our agro entrepreneurs, and these are both primary and processed products. There are examples of where in some countries to satisfy the needs of the oil and gas vessels offshore, people imported a lot of the products, and the spin-off from that imports went into the local markets. We really don't want that to happen. Thirdly, we need to remove the impediments to regional trade. At the moment, trade within the region is almost at a standstill because of inadequate transport facilities, be it air or be it by shipment. I have a friend who was trying to move product from Guyana to Dominica, and it took him 6 weeks to get the samples from Guyana to Dominica. And we're not talking about moving the product as yet, right? So we need to look at that very carefully. The whole question of non-tariff barriers have to be addressed in terms of agricultural health and food safety standards, phytosanitary and sanitary and phytosanitary measures. We have to have a common agreement that will allow movement between member states. And this is important for Guyana because with its large, as I said, with its large volumes, large size and small population, to have a vibrant agricultural sector, it must have access to these markets. And it must have access to the markets to a long distance. I see, I'm nearly wrapping up. Terence is you.
Yes.
Then the whole question of finance. I think we all will believe and know that COP27 was a disaster relative to finance to do climate change work for developing countries. And this is particularly so because finance is one of the three priorities that was identified by member states. And without going into much detail, communication. There's not a good communication program that will deal with. And I think maybe Guyana is a little exception, but generally in the region, there's not a good communication problem. Now, finally, what is Guyana doing? We could see the geospatial diversification that is taking place. The work in the intermediate savannas, some work in the Bacarimas, the work on the coastal areas in enhancing things that need water, like shrimp and fish. There's probably more work needed to be done on drains and irrigation for the coastal and riverine areas. And building the climate resilience is particularly important. Mr. Co-Chair, particularly Terry, let me wrap up for now, and I could deal with any further questions or comments during the time that you've allocated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chesney, for that insightful overview of the scope of the thing and the uh, some of the emerging the geospatial diversification, what's going on in the savannas, some of the things in the coastal regions. Uh, the fact that it is a technological, and I'll come back to you and ask you some questions about this technologically intensive bit. There's a particular point that I want to make there, but I like to say you kind of cued Joel nicely by saying agriculture is a business, and so this being his area, Joel, can you give us a sense of how well is the business of agriculture doing? I note in the Ministry of Agriculture's website, there's an injection of a 1.1 billion to aid, the Rose Hall estates reopening. I noted the development of agro-processing facilities at Crabwood Creek, noting Guyana aiming for self-sufficiency in corn and soybean production by 2025. How is the business of this going? Give us a sense of the fiscal implications of the agricultural sector and its potential links with the emerging oil and gas sector. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you. Good day to your viewers, and thank you for that very generous introduction and for bringing me in at this point in time. Well, to your question pointedly, how well is the business? The evidence is in the numbers. Both you and I are numbers. We're numbers guys, right? And the evidence is in the numbers. So let me speak to that quickly before I give some comments in some of the contextual discussion that was presented by the other speakers. Now, as all the speakers alluded to, that there are two broad contexts. One, there is the regional food security agenda led by Guyana, and then there is this context in terms of the oil economy, what's happening in the oil and gas sector. In terms of the regional front, and as Dr. Chesney pointed out yesterday, there was a news report that stated that we are well on track in terms of achieving that 25 by 2025 target. And just to quantify the size of the market, we are looking at a $2.5 billion US market. The regional import bill is somewhere north of a 5 billion US and growing, right? So half of that is what we're targeting to reduce it by. Therein lies the opportunity for the region by 2025. Now, looking at our agriculture GDP growth for the past 10 years, we have achieved the highest growth in 2022, which evidence the achievement in that regard, the investment in the agriculture sector by the government, and of course, the supporting policy framework. So, for example, in 2013, the sector grew by 4%. In 2014, it grew by 8%. In 2016, there was a negative growth of 11%. In 2019, there was 0% growth. And in 2021, we also had a negative growth of 9%. And these, as normally associated with agriculture, weather, inclement weather, and other factors, what happened in the sugar industry and so on, contributed, several factors contributed to these outcomes. However, in 2022, the sector grew by 12%, which is the highest rate of growth, in the last 10 years, in the last decade. When we look at the budgetary allocation to the sector, there has been a steady increase in terms of budgetary allocation. From 2020 up to this last budget, the 2023 budget, the budgetary allocation has increased by 65% to reach $15 billion from a position of $9.4 billion in 2020. So that's in terms of budgetary allocation. Looking at the agriculture exports is north of 300 million US and accounting for about 20% of the non-oil exports. And in terms of contribution to GDP, the agriculture sector contributes about 25% to the non-oil GDP. Now, putting that now into the context of what everybody has said, it is clearly evident of the fact that the government is making a concerted effort to increase food production, tapping into the regional food market, tying it to regional food security. And if, truthfully speaking, you really can't look at the agriculture sector in isolation because it is interlinked, as pointed out, to the other sectors. In order to increase food production or to increase, the true potential of the agriculture sector, you need to make the necessary investments in the infrastructure. The energy project is important because when we are talking about the value-added products, that one of the video, the clip that you showed, Terence, that presenter was talking about, we need cheap energy to achieve that. Investment in the support infrastructure as well, and we've seen sizable allocation in the budget to build out the road infrastructure, farm to market access road, logistical, improving the logistics as well. So all of that allocation, there is a big allocation into the 2023 budget for drainage and irrigation as well, which is directly linked to agriculture, right? Drainage and irrigation budget is about $20 billion or 100 million US in the 2023 budget. So to sum up my contribution to the conversation, Terence, and my fellow panelists, is that the government is making tangible investment in the sector. We've seen steady increase in the agriculture budget. In terms of leading the regional, I just want to, if I may correct Dr. Chesney a bit, he said that this regional agenda was started in 2018 by Prime Minister Motley. Actually, this regional agenda was always led by Guyana since in the post-independence era by consecutive president, head of states, including LFS. Conceptually, he started a concept. Real efforts in terms of implementation at the regional level started in the early 2000s, under the then president, who is now vice president, Dr. Bharajapil. And what happened during those days, when we as a country was pushing this regional agenda, the rest of the region didn't see the importance or didn't pay much attention to it. Now, however, against the backdrop of global external shocks, global crises, COVID pandemic, Ukraine-Russia war, was happening geopolitically in that region. All of this have amplified the need to revisit and to escalate this objective, why regional food security is important, regional energy security is also important. All of this go hand in hand, together. So I'll pause there for now in my commentary and open up the questions.
David, so we have a sense of the broad scale and scope of things. We have a sense of some of what is being done correctly. We have a sense of some of the challenges, and we also have a sense that this is a $5 billion U.S. Industry as we think about the region. Offer some thoughts, and then I want to come back and begin to pose some questions to the panelists.
Thank you, Terence, and thank you, Joel and Arlington. Excellent setting of the stage. And I'll draw your attention. Just this morning, we had one of our colleagues, Dr. Arnold McIntyre, publish an op-ed in oilnow.gy on Guyana's economic energy boom and the labor market constraints. And you should all look into that. because one of the key issues that we're all looking into as the economy is growing is skills and labor challenges to get into all these economic activities, and particularly in the sectors that are labor intensive, which even with the technology, ICT, and value added downstream production that Arlington mentioned, agriculture remains labor skilled centered. So that's something we need to look into. I wanted to focus particularly on the potential in terms of that value chain of primary products, crops, and agro processing, and maybe then get some feedback both from Arlington and from Joel, particularly as we're seeing not just the issue of the food security agenda, but just overall the what I call the sort of upgrading, modernization of the sector, as is occurring in many other sectors in Guyana, in terms of the linkage and the needs of finance and capitalization, usage of new technologies, the value chain relations, and of course then the commercialization. And Arlington has a wealth of experience, particularly with Central America, where the ICA headquarters are in Costa Rica. And our company, we've worked a lot with that in the commercialization sector, where we've been seeing how, with the functioning of effective regional markets, and in the case of Central America, a common market, in the case of CARICOM, a single market and economy, where companies can develop and use comparative advantages of countries that are very good and competitive at producing the primary products, and then countries that have good experience and competitiveness in the processing and the commercialization of products. So, for example, today in the United States, you go and you buy dairy products, grain products, beans, and so on from Central America, and the product may say Central American product packaged in El Salvador. And everybody knows, of course, El Salvador is a small economy, but it's extremely industrialized. You say, well, wait a minute, there's no, that this level of agriculture is not taking place in El Salvador. Where are they growing this from? Well, what happens is commercial firms at the regional level invest and purchase the raw material production from countries that do have that advantage, like, say, Honduras or Nicaragua, purchase it in mass from producers there, invest with producers there for the quality controls, the levels of regulations and standards that are needed, and then do the packaging and distribution and commercialization separately. This is something that not one country can do alone. We even see a large economy like Mexico does that commercialization, linking up with producers at the smaller level like Guatemala and so on. So I think one of the key things is going to be how the Guyana opportunity is benefited from both the regional, but then I would say even more the hemispheric market in agricultural trade, and particularly the primary and agro-processing components. And there's a lot of experience in this. I mentioned the Central American case. Dominican Republic has been very successful. But now, just 2 days ago, the new ambassadors of Chile and Colombia and Mexico presented credentials in Guyana. And I know they are bringing with them agricultural interested companies looking to see how their experience, Chile in terms of the fishing industry, a country that never produced one piece of salmon ever, is now supplying salmon, tilapia, and many other fisheries throughout the world. So to see how we can leverage that and bring some of that skills experience to complement the resources on the ground. And then thirdly and finally, what we have regionally. Already has been mentioned the case of the Barbados sheep. Just last month, we had the session on investment with Kamal Samaru from DDL, and they're advancing with the dairy milk production with support from Israel and importing cattle and so on. And two of my favorite regional examples in terms of companies that are very at the cutting edge and best practice right now in the region, Grace in Jamaica and also Jamaica Producers, which everybody used to think of as a banana company way back in since the colonial time. Well, guess what? Jamaica Producers is not just a banana company anymore. They're into food, beverages, own companies in Europe, in Central and South America, and in the United States. So we need to look to see how we can take advantage of what Guyana offers that for the rest of the region is not there, which is the land, the production capacity, and the extension capacity, and see how we can leverage that and not need to reinvent the wheel where we have examples and support systems in the rest of the region and the hemisphere. One final point to see if we could get some comments. The linkage to what is the fastest and largest growing industry in the region, which is tourism, what we're now calling the visitor economy. It's way more than tourism and entertainment and hospitality. It's what we're calling now the visitor economy. And of course, visitors eat and drink and consume. So, to the degree that we're getting more and more visitors, not just with hotel chains and the traditional tourism, we have a growing demand. And we need to see how we can supply that demand, critical not just for the taste of the visitor, but to transform the taste of the visitor for local. People go to places like Dominica, like St. Lucia, like the Dominican Republic, because guess what? They can have 3 meals a day of food that is 100% locally produced, not tins from Miami, but local production. And there's an entire visitor industry economy that is now growing on that, what we call agro-tourism in the coffee sector, the cocoa sector, and others. And I think that's another area, and it'd be interesting to discuss what opportunities exist there for Guyana as well. So let me leave it there, and thank you all again. Very interesting and thoughtful discussion.
Well, thank you, David. And in the interest, so I wanted to save this question for last, but I thought because I suspected it would be a bit harder. But I maybe let's jump to the hard question. So one of our viewers, Andre Bradley, sort of puts this into the mix for us. He says a recent Stabrook News editorial demonstrated, and so this was one of the questions I wanted to ask about, you know, the we see sort of some creeping Dutch disease. So it's sort of saying that the Dutch disease is killing the agricultural sector in Guyana, and he's worried that the government is not sort of seeing the writing on the wall. And as we, as Andre puts it, fantasize about food security and implementing local content legislation, these things, for example, opening I visited actually a few years ago at Rose Hall, and it was kind of almost closed, reopening Rose Hall. And he's noting that, in the same way, we have this thing that you just mentioned that McIntyre notes about this sort of labor challenges. There's not enough people to do the job. So farmers can't find the necessary labor to plant and harvest the crops. And he wanted to get a sense of the panelists kind of thinking about this Stabrook News editorial and this broad sense that, in a way, perhaps we ought to be implementing things better on the ground. And so, I'll start with Joel and then ask Arlington to comment on this, and then perhaps if you wanted to add to it, David, you could come back. And then I had a few questions that I wanted to take the prerogative of the moderator to ask. So I'll start with the hard one. I mean, the thinking was that agricultural expansion should diminish the tendency towards the Dutch disease, but we seem to be having this even as we expand in the agricultural sense. So, are we doing it? Are we doing it right? Joel, you want to take a stab?
So let me take a stab at that. So first, let me acknowledge the true challenge indeed with the sector. We do have generally a shortage of labor problem. So let me first of all acknowledge that, and then I'll come back to that and dissect that a bit. So the Starbuck News editorial that is being referenced, where the Dutch disease is killing the agricultural sector, that is not factual. So we got to understand what is the Dutch disease. The Dutch disease is when you have a change in relative price, when you have an appreciation of the exchange rate. So an appreciation in the exchange rate would cause agriculture export to diminish because it will become more expensive in export markets. And so you have a decline in exports, a decline in sales, and so a decline, you kill the industry. That is not happening. The government, the policymaker is very mindful of that, and that is not happening. Um, the issue with the labor, we got to understand, someone said in a group, in a chat group, and I respond to this, Guyana does not have, we got to understand the difference between a labor shortage and a skills shortage. We do not have a labor shortage per se. What we have is a skills shortage. And then that is coupled with a whole host of other socio-economic issues. And let me give you examples. Different sectors are competing for labor. The oil and gas industry and the support sector, there is wage inflation. So naturally, people are gravitating, going to where they're being paid more money. So this is what not just the agriculture sector, but other sectors are suffering this problem. So naturally, they're forced to pay better wages to attract people. And then that is coupled with skills. We don't have skills in the industry. And as one of the panelists said, people don't find the agriculture sector as an attractive sector to work in. So we have to evolve to move in order to move from a primary producing sector to a secondary, tertiary producing sector. We have to evolve. And I would say the biggest problem here is on the part of the business sector. Because in order to achieve these goals that we're speaking about, food security, the government, one, is accommodative in the context of providing the framework to allow this to happen. The government is implementing the conducive policy framework, providing incentives, for example, removing taxes from agriculture equipment, providing tax incentives, um, including it in the overall incentives, integrating these incentives in the overall fiscal framework, making the investments in the infrastructure and so forth. But then it comes back to the business sector having to take the initiative, having to take the risk, having to make the investments. For the past 2 decades, the business sector, yes, there are challenges with energy and so on, but the business sector have been, not very innovative, not wanting, do not like to invest in research and development and so on. So the business sector in itself has to change its culture. We have to change our culture in terms of how we do business and make these investments in this sector to make this goal or this target achievable.
Thanks. Dr. Chesney, do you want to sort of offer a comment? I think this has come up in a number of things that we've, can you give a kind of regional sense of, as you expand in agriculture, this question of labor, even not specifically to the question of, the Stabrook News editorial, but to this fact of the need for labor and the need for, broadly speaking, a more technologically sophisticated approach to investing in agriculture, and how it sort of shapes. How does Guyana track with the rest of the Caribbean? Are they doing it better than we're doing it?
Let me say that I agree with Joel, and there's something else I disagree with him, and I'll leave it later. That there's a skill shortage, not necessarily a labor shortage. I think that is very clear. There's a skill shortage, right? And this goes back to, in addition to skill shortage, there's an organizational shortage, right? Now, the skill shortage, we are working, some of us are working with University of Guyana, University of West Indies, University of Trinidad and Tobago, Adicos and Suriname, to see how they could hone their programs to be better able to meet the demands of the oil and gas sector for the region, right? It's true that oil and gas now is Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname soon to be coming on board, right? But you have to start putting in place that training capacity, that improving the human capacity of the region to be able to provide the skills that is now required. So those, I agree with you fully in terms of skills. In terms of, and we when we link our culture to CSME, the movement of skills becomes very important also, right? When we, as part of the CPSO group, when we looked at it, unless you deal with the CSME, you can't deal with agriculture in Ghana or the region, because there are impediments within the implementation of the CSME that will enhance or not enhance the non-viability of agriculture in Ghana. Right? Okay. So we need to look at organization. It is, to me, a little bit unfair to say that Ghana is going to suffer the Dutch disease or the resource curse, right? Because we have an oil and gas industry that is very organized in terms of human and financial capital, right? We have an agriculture sector that at best is disorganized, and the traditional senior business people are not directly interested in agriculture. DDL is a good example of interest, but how many DDLs are there in the region, or how many DDLs are there are there in Ghana, right? So the thing is, and this comes as David knows, I've been stressing that corporate social responsibility of the oil companies must expand beyond Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad, and to the rest of the region. Because unless you could develop that area of that finance, that we have, as Joel said, we have a private sector that is not innovative enough, and maybe to some extent, investment averse, right? Particularly in agriculture, and this is the tradition of our culture, right? Investment averse. You always hear that the banks have a lot of money, but most of it doesn't go into the majority. You can't get a loan from most commercial banks to go into agriculture, and this is not Ghana alone. This is the region, and to some extent, in the Central America. Okay, so I'm saying that it would be a little unfair in the editorial to say that Ghana is not doing enough to keep out in the agriculture sector, to keep out the Dutch disease or the resource curse, right? I think you're not comparing apples and apples or oranges and oranges. Joel, let me address the question you made. The question of regional agriculture didn't start with LFSB. It started with Dr. Eric Williams, who first developed the regional agriculture concept approach, right? The regional food plan, right? What I'm saying with Prime Minister Otley is that she has brought it back onto the table. President Jagdo, as he was then, took the lead. I helped him to write the Jagdo initiative, so I know about that, right? But when the thing was dying, Prime Minister Motley brought it back. As you said, the other heads weren't interested really. She brought it back and put it in a context that was difficult for them to get out of. The context of an establishment of a reinvigorization of the CSME, right? What she basically said, without good agriculture, there's no CSME. And this is what I give her a lot of praise for. I think I've answered the questions. I hope Terence and David. But David, you all put a lot of questions on the table. Boy.
So, well, let me put another one from Brad Ribeiro, and so maybe Dr. Chesney, you can respond to this, being a kind of expert in this area. So the question is about, as you talked about, the resilience and the climate change aspects that are in some sense already in play. And so this question is about the future temperatures of land at the equator, and shouldn't we be investing in some kind of indoor farming? And so I wanted to know, to what extent are we already involved in any farming practices that that go to, kind of looking down the road and thinking that if I offer a personal anecdote, a good friend of mine, Dr. Nicholas Waldron, who's a vet in Georgetown, he runs some poultry business, and one of the questions we discussed at some point in the past was the fact that Guyana was indeed hotter, and so the mortality rate for chickens for chicks was sort of higher, and the need for cooler kind of incubators so give a thought on as we look further out, the kinds of farming practices that perhaps we ought to be tilting towards, and the kind of farming. That's another question that I want to ask, but let's start with Brad's question.
Well, Brad is correct that we have in higher temperatures. We've seen this, right? In the last 10, 15 years, I think the average has gone up by 5 degrees centigrade, right? And now you can't grow everything in shade houses. So we have to have some more varieties, some new nut species, new varieties that are adapted to this higher temperatures and higher and more drought, maybe more drought resistant, the extremes, right? And this is where I believe that those people that are making all this amount of money from oil should help the universities, should help the NARIs, help the GLDAs to put in place the methodology and the systems that could allow Dr. Waldron's poultry not to have such a high mortality rate by looking at the pen structures and okay. Going back to they are led by Dominican Republic and Guyana and Trinidad. There are some commercial enterprises dealing with shade houses. Let's call them shade houses for now. In St. Lucia, there's one guy who has done a lot of work on containerization for the growth of mushrooms for the what do you call it, David, the visitory sector, right? So there are examples. Some people are claiming that because of imports, subsidized imports, competition is unfair. So we have to look at that. We have to look at that also. But the technology is there, right? Trinidad is now training 100 young people in the production of fruits and vegetables using that technology, right? With assistance from NARI and the University of the West Indies.
So I was holding this one back to close on, but since you mentioned NARI and the Guyana School of Agriculture, this question seems to be coming up about how we're connecting our young people to these opportunities. So I went both Joel and you, Dr. Chesney, to, if you were giving an advice to a young person who has just graduated from GSA with a diploma for 2 years and still can't find an employment opportunity, how well are we doing the business of emphasizing agriculture if the people who we're training are not immediately finding access to the opportunities in that sector? And what would be your advice in this moment?
You're asking a hard question. Okay. Let me say that I think the universities and the Guyana schools of agriculture, the ECIAFs in Trinidad, they need to do a little bit more work on providing agribusiness personnel, not necessarily science accredited personnel. I think there's a major difference, and I've seen a lot of people don't have the skills to come out and do it. Now, having said that, and this may not be the case for Guyana, the ability to access a suitable land and access capital. All right, a young fellow comes out, a young lady comes out and goes to the bank. She has no collateral. She has no experience of doing these things. So Is it the role of governments
Yeah.
to subsidize
This
or
reminded
to
me of
guarantee?
Guyana had something called Guy Bank, and I think it had some kind of rule. It's similar to what you're describing. Maybe there's a need
Yeah.
for a kind of small, uh, a small scale Guy Bank to encourage young entrepreneurs to to find a way to develop these sort of agri businesses that you're describing. Joel, do you want to
Yeah.
comment?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges historically that we need to come out of. We need to change our thinking. You know, the way we think about business, we got to come out of the old thinking because a lot of the problems we have, we can solve it with innovative thinking. And let me give you some examples. We might not have a guy bank, but is there avenues to access financing for agriculture? I may not have the land, but there is someone else who has land, arable land, not doing anything with it. And I can tell you, I spent about 3 years of my professional life in Northwest. And Northwest, I think, has the most fertile agriculture land in the country. And historically, Northwest used to ship agriculture produce to Georgetown. And there was the gold rush some years ago, and everybody went into gold mines. So now it has become a predominantly gold mining industry. Everybody stopped planting. Everybody stopped planting. And now we have to ship agriculture produce to Northwest, right? Same things happening at the macro level with oil and gas. We've experienced this historically. But in terms of the business aspect, we have a lot of fertile land in agriculture. We got a lot of people who got these land. I don't, if I want to get into agriculture, I don't necessarily need to go and get a new plot of land. I could go to Northwest and partner with somebody, bring together a few people with equity. There's a lot of people right now in my business. There's a lot of people, I can literally match demand with supply. There are a lot of people looking for opportunities with capital to invest in good, viable projects. And there are people who have the projects, who have the business idea, they don't have the capital. So we could match this. So this thing with access to capital and access to land, and we don't have the land, it's a lack of innovative thinking and business acumen. And that is the problem with agriculture. And we got to get out of that quickly. And in a structured and organized way, we got to find a way to match demand with supply and build capacity through training, entrepreneurial development, and all these other things together to build out this agricultural enterprise.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned this. For some reason, not quite clear to me. I've had lots of questions come prior to the program from its announcement, and you just mentioned the Northwest. And I had a question earlier, email from someone named Desmona Baptiste, and Desmona said, on seeing the announcement of the program, "Good morning. I'm living in the Northwest District, Aruka Mountain, and I want to make my place here into a farm." So there seems to be a kind of underlying uh, desire on the part of many individuals to be involved in, and perhaps David, you can offer some insight here. uh, what's the sort of architecture, what's the kind of infrastructure that perhaps could be pointed to say, here's an infrastructure for individual level people wanting to be involved in farming, small businesses wanting to be involved in some farming entrepreneurship. What are some models that we can look to if you have any sense in that regard?
Well, I mentioned some of the regional experiences that are quite good competitively in agriculture, Dominican Republic, St. Lucia, Dominica, but also at the Central America level. But I think one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is, on the one hand, we have government corporate initiatives that we've discussed, the Ministry of Agriculture, DDL, the Barbados Black Sheep Initiative, and so on. But on the other hand, particularly in an open market like Guyana, I think if we begin to scratch the surface and do the research, we're going to find that people are coming into the country and looking at where are there business opportunities beyond oil and gas, which is a now saturated and pretty much well supplied sector, and looking for individual ventures that can be developed, whether for the domestic market and or regional market. And if there isn't some kind of public private coordination taking place, we may find ourselves a few years from now with a lot of business ventures with uh, investors, for lack of a better word, from all over the world who have come into Guyana and started partnering with individuals in Guyana, but in a disorganized and individualized manner, when this could be really structured in a strategic manner in terms of the development of agricultural produce and agro processing business for the country. I just wanted to add one point which I didn't, and it may be out of our purview, but it'd be interesting to see how this new initiative on sugar with Guatemala industry coming into Guyana, coordinated by the government, will develop, because it may be a good case study in terms of other sectors. It may not be. I'm not an expert in the industry, but I do know Guatemala is a very competitive sugar industry country and have done very well, and makes sense to bring in a partner from outside that can help transform and develop an industry that should be first class in Guyana, but has been declining over the years. So I just wanted to throw that out in terms of another example of activity taking place in the agribusiness sector.
So I want to. So this is a question that's been out there also, and I want to throw this one, a second question from Andre Brantley, and it's sort of this linkage between say this coordinated approach to a sector, and you know, and then at a certain level a kind of protectionism, and somehow I think we haven't gotten quite the balance yet. So I want to give Joel a quick run at this one, and then I have a my own question. The time is, I've just looked at the time and it's running out on us. So Joel, you get 2 minutes to kind of give a response to Andrew. So he's
I'll
noting.
take less than 2 minutes, 30 seconds. So the Local Content Act is specific to the oil and gas sector, and it is only confined to 40 subsectors. And the oil and gas business is over 200 plus goods and services that they require. So the local content is not, it's not a barrier for the agriculture sector or any other sector. And even in the oil and gas sector with the Local Content Act, it is also still not a barrier, because there are certain provisions in the act that cater for if we don't have the local capacity, and once that is justified, then there is no issue with a foreign company providing that service. And then there is also the provision to cater for to build local capacity through joint ventures. So the Local Content Act is really no barrier in that regard.
Thanks. So I wanted to take it because the time is running out. So some years ago, I had sort of, I read this book by Dr. Trotz and a few others. It's called A Guide to Medicinal Plants of Coastal Guyana. I'm sure some of you might have read this book. And what it was the second in this series. There's also a Guide to Medicinal Plants for Trinidad and Tobago, which was published by the Caribbean, by the Commonwealth Secretariat in, I think, 1983.
Compton C4 did it.
And so I thought, that perhaps as we, some years ago. So this was, I think I wrote this in 2020. So the piece was titled sort of Oil and Okra. And one, I like okra, and two, I sort of thought, what's a good intersection? And the point is, there were so many medicinal uses for various plants, flora and fauna of Guyana. And I don't think we ever had a kind of coordinated effort to to maximize in this context? And I wanted to take the advantage here of you, Dr. Chesney, to say, what's your thought in terms of like having some, at least some carve out? I mean, would a biotech sector in agriculture develop without some actual support from the government? And have we done this in any way? I mean, we know sort of like the cancer causing. I was at research thing at the University of Guyana, folks doing research on the anti-cancer properties of things like Corilla. And so it seems to me like there's a huge technological thing there that is not being exploited. What's your thinking in that regard?
In the last op-ed I did, I talked about nutraceuticals and herbal medicines, right? Because of the wide diverse flora and fauna diversity we have in this region, there's a lot of scope. Now, if you go to Suriname, you'll find a guy doing some tremendous work on healing people using local herbs, right? But he cannot move one piece of it outside of Suriname, right? Because there's been no clinical work done, right? He cannot tell you, I need a half gram to do this, right? Or a quarter gram, so many days a week. And he knows it in his head, and maybe some of the people around him. So there has to be a linkage between the exploitation of these herbs and its use in the traditional medical sense, all right? Now, let me give you a joke. It's a joke, but a serious joke. There's one nut in Trinidad, which is very, very good, they claim. I won't tell you for what. But what you do, you cut the nut in half, you boil that, and you throw the other half as far as possible away from you, because if you drink that also, you're dead, right? So these sort of fine-tuning have to be done to make better use of our herbal medicines. And there's a guy in Trinidad that does a fair amount of work. I can't remember his name now, but he has a big establishment selling herbal medicines.
Yeah, thanks. There are a tremendous amount of issues that emerge from this. And so, but in the interest of kind of keeping the discussion relatively limited and mindful of the time, I'm just going to bring one last question in, and this was coming from David Roberts, and so the question here is, so broadly, what are some of the efforts that go to strengthening the institutions that are necessary that would give kind of investors confidence into entering this agricultural sector? Are there some things that we can point to that say, okay, here are these things that are happening that make it that make it an even bet for you to enter this sector? You're not lose all of your treasure in this bet. Can we point to a few things that
So I'll go first. I broadly speaking, when I don't know if the person who asked the question is an economist, but economists used to love to use this term institutional strengthening and institutional capacity and so forth. But we have to give life and meaning and speak of this in a very pragmatic context. So I am not aware personally that there are any institutional barriers from a governmental perspective to enter into the agriculture sector. If you're speaking about institutional processes, or in terms of the bureaucracy, in terms of getting things approved, permits, for example, getting a proposal process for incentives and so forth, yes, there are some there are some red tape in the system, generally not specific to the agriculture sector. And I can speak to what the government is doing generally because it's public knowledge. The government is improving investing in improving the overall delivery of public service in terms of digital transformation, investing in technology, improving the processes. There work ongoing in that regard, um, to improve the service. That will take time. So that is what I can speak to. I'm not aware that there is institutional barriers per se for any sector, not just the agriculture sector.
Thanks. So we're pushing up against the end of the hour. Maybe if I can start with you, Dr. Chesney, if you can, offer some kind of general closing thoughts, and then I'll come to you, Joel, and then finally David will give us thank you and close out.
Well, the first closing thought I will say is thank you, folks, for bringing the subject to the public view. Right? For someone who's been in agriculture for some time, we don't normally get this level of discussion. What we have to try to do now is to move this discussion into action, and I think this is where this group could work on with the support of governments. I think most governments are aware of what is required. Between Joel and David, there have been three words that I hear keep coming up: structure, organization, and administration. I think those three things are critical for us to move forward. And the role of government is not necessary, not in production, but in facilitation of the production, making the things available so that production could take place. Those will be some of my comments. Clearly, there's a lot of room for detailed discussion that could take place at a later date as we move forward. But as I said earlier on, the mere fact that heads are now seeing this as our food security as one of the three major priorities for this region, and for the discussions with extra-regional governments and elements, is a move in the right direction. The point that Joel also made is we have to improve our ease of doing business. Most countries in the region fall very low on the ease of doing business, and this will take time, right? But we have to start and start assiduously at it. Thank you, Terence.
Thank you, Dr. Chesney. Joel?
I want to end by saying there was a time in our country when the private sector complained the government is not doing this, the government is not doing this, and complain about the policies and so on. Now the government is so accommodative, so business friendly, even more so than the private sector. Now the government is complaining, literally, the government is complaining, the private sector is not making the investments and so on. So there's a complete, 360-degree turn. Yes, there is a lot to be improved. On the point of I should also say that with the amount of investment proposals that I'm aware of in the system for land, for example, agriculture land, this is why the investment in the infrastructure side to open up the land, the demand is far greater than the supply right now. So the investment allocation towards infrastructure in new development to open up new land for agriculture purposes, residential, commercial, all of that is important to achieving that food security goal. And lastly, I think it is commendable on the part of the government, evidently, in terms of being ahead of the target or on track to achieving that target. We've had the highest growth in the agriculture sector recorded in 2022 of 12%, which is the highest in the last decade. So that is very commendable on the part of the government. So those are my final closing remarks.
Terence, could I have half second?
Yes, you certainly can.
I think in the discussions we perhaps have not paid enough attention on the MSMEs. right? And they, in the past, are the persons or the group that have really carried food security in Guyana and in the region. And we have to be able to use those words from Joel and David. We have to organize and structure them in a way that they could benefit from this new dimension. Thank you.
Thank you. David, you get the last word.
Yes, want to thank Arlington and Joel. This has been a very productive and thoughtful discussion, and obviously food for thought for more areas of follow up for us. We've discussed medicinal science, the therapeutic aspects, the business component, and facilitation of things. Uh, I'm particularly keen on making sure that we follow up and look at some of these experiences and initiatives that are occurring now in the marketplace. The DDL initiative in dairy, the Guatemala support initiative in sugar, and so on, because it's going to give us a sense of what works, what does not work, and what are some of the benchmarks and best practices for agricultural development, grosso modo, across the country, and then the implications regionally. I did fail to mention yesterday, one of my colleagues in Colombia received the notice and told me, oh, we're going to join the webinar today because we actually have a consortium of agricultural companies in Colombia that is looking to diversify its work beyond Colombia and Central America into Central America and the Caribbean, and Guyana looks very attractive. So I would harp on the fact that beyond oil and gas, people need to realize that the economic growth situation in Guyana is making it very attractive to partners from all over the world. And we need to be cognizant of managing that properly, looking for the value added, and ensuring that this involvement from outside of the region is positive for the country and is managed properly in terms of benchmark best practice experiences that can be brought to bear to support the industry, in this particular case, agriculture. But as I've mentioned throughout these webinars, in many sectors of the economy, Guyana is a hot market right now. The government is not capable of managing every single entry of business people going into the country to look at opportunities. So there's a need to be very cognizant of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, colleagues. And this has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. And look forward to seeing you guys the second Sunday. I said Sunday, but the
Wednesday.
second Wednesday of March. And I think we will have a very interesting program. Uh, it is likely that we will have a launch of a white paper done by Dr. Ulrich Trotz, which will, attempt to address one of the big challenging questions that we have about, how do we balance our oil and gas exploitation with some of the environmental climate change demands. And so, we'll switch, as we saw here, the resilience in agriculture is also dependent upon these questions around climate change. And so, thank you again once for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in March. Thank you, colleagues. Have a wonderful
Thank you
evening.
very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Bye. Yeah. That